Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Matthew Petrusik, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and host of the Word on Fire show. Thank you for joining us. Is safety culture good for us? The words "stay safe" became a popular way of saying goodbye during the pandemic, understandably so. The pandemic, however, has long come to an end. Yet the category of safety still seems to dominate the culture, and not only in medicine. Terms like safe spaces, trigger warnings, harm reduction, microaggression, emotional well-being, and fragility are dominating the governance of many institutions, including K-12 schools, higher education, corporate human resource departments, NGOs, and even governmental agencies. At the same time, this hyper-focus on safety does not seem to have had any positive effect on most people's lives. In fact, by some measurements, our society is more physically compromised and mentally delicate than ever. The connection between promoting safety and seeing actual improvements in mental and physical health, in other words, seems more complex than it may initially appear. Today, to discuss the contemporary embrace of safety and how it does and does not overlap with a Catholic understanding of the individual and common good, is Bishop Robert Barron. Well, welcome back to the studio, Bishop. Today we're going to be talking about the contemporary embrace of safety culture. And I want you to let you know this is a safe space.
I'm glad to hear that.
Hope you feel affirmed.
I'm relieved to hear that.
But before we jump into the topic, what have you been up to lately?
Oh, a lot of things. It's confirmation season. So for most bishops around the country, I'm running around my diocese confirming kids, which I enjoy very much. In California, we did just for intensely in 2 months, all the confirmations in my region. So I would confirm thousands of kids. Probably fewer kids here, but maybe as many trips around. What I like a lot of things about it. One is getting around my diocese, so I see all kinds of places. And I just find confirmations, uplifting and to try to inspire these kids. So that's been my main preoccupation the last couple of weeks.
Oh, that's beautiful. All right, so let's then move into, is safety culture good for us? Now, some may hear the title of this show and think, well, obviously, yeah, who in their right mind would critique safety? But as our viewers know, so much depends upon the specific definition we're using.
Yeah.
So to start off, let's get into that definitional level. If you could inhabit the secular mind, what do you think the secular mind conceives of when it thinks of safety?
Well, I think maybe the dictionary definition, something like the state of being protected from suffering and from danger and from risk. That's safety. And as you say, obviously that's a good thing. Who's against safety? If you got a choice, sure, I'm going to opt for for safety over danger, in a purely abstract sense. The question, I think, Matt, is how we prioritize things. So is it of value? Sure, it's of value, but values are always arranged hierarchically. Now, maybe we'll get into that later, but I think that's something missing very much in our society is a sense of a hierarchy of value. Is safety the highest value? Absolutely not, it seems to me. It's of value, but not like the supreme value. And upon that distinction, a lot depends.
We'll move later in the show to looking at it, how Catholicism in particular might conceive of safety and put it within that hierarchy of values. But it seems even at the outset that in order to get a good definition of safety, we're going to have to sort of move into the anthropological level and ask, what is a human person? What's the nature of the human good?
Yeah.
And, some may hear that kind of language and roll their eyes thinking, say it's so obvious what safety is. Why do we have to go to that abstract level? But can we really avoid it?
No, and you're right in suggesting the good. So I use the language of value, but good is the same thing really. What is the good for us? And there's a range of goods arranged hierarchically under the aegis finally of the summum bonum, the highest good, which is God. And so, as you suggest, a healthy Christian anthropology has a sense of the human being in freedom and intelligence seeking goods and values, ultimately the highest good of God, and then arranging one's moral life in terms of these goods to be sought. Now, to kind of cut to the chase, sometimes pursuing certain very high goods involves danger, involves risk. If I say, oh, safety, that's my summum bonum, that's the highest good, well, come on. Then I'm going to live a very dull life, actually, and a life that's not morally compelling.
It seems that the secular conception of safety, and one way to put it might be sort of utilitarian. Sort of the highest good is to avoid suffering at all costs, both mental suffering and physical suffering. And so whatever helps us to avoid that suffering is good, and whatever doesn't help us is bad. What do you think about that sort of utilitarian assessment?
Yeah, well, it again gets the goods wrong. It gets the goods in the wrong order. The highest goods, recognized by even the classical philosophers, the virtues, these things that habituate us toward the accomplishment of certain moral excellences, those are the high goods. But then I'd push it even further. When you bring God into the picture, there's a summum bonum beyond even those, and the virtues are meant to order us to those. We would speak of the theological virtues. So you get the faith, hope, and love, which order you to God very directly. So all of that takes precedence over mere, let's say, physical, or even psychological safety. In the service of those goods, some of our greatest people have accepted very dangerous conditions, right? Look at the martyrs as the limit case, I suppose. But when you put safety at that top, everything will get skewed. The whole system will begin to collapse.
Another way of getting at the distinction here is to ask, is the difference that we're going to be looking at with the Catholic conception one of degree or kind? So is the critique of the secular conception of safety that it's got the right idea, it just takes it too far? Or does it actually have some wrong-headed ideas about what safety is?
Yeah, no, I think you're quite right in suggesting it's grounded in a faulty anthropology. It's very reductive anthropology. Once you accept the reality of the soul, you accept the reality of an aspiration toward goods that transcend even this world. I mean, pure moral goods, pure moral achievement. You're beyond, I just want to keep myself safe, either physically or psychologically. You've moved into a different space. Indeed, you're right, qualitatively different moral space. And it's the collapse of that sense of the objectivity of the moral in a way that's led to all this. Because, look, we can all agree, I suppose, anyone, from believer to atheist, everyone in between, that, well, yeah, doing harm to your body, that's a bad thing. But if that's all we can agree on, then what we're left with is this regimen of safety as a supreme value. But if this higher moral world opens up, well, then it relativizes those concerns. So you're right, that's the issue. It's an anthropological issue.
So there's a well-known social critic and journalist. Her name is Abigail Shrier, and she recently published a book called Bad Therapy: Why Kids Aren't Growing Up. And the basic argument of the book is that we're actually doing more harm than good to children by shielding them from sort of the normal pains of mental and physical pains of life. So let me read a sort of representative quote and then get your take on it. She's particularly critical of what she calls the mental health industry. She uses the word industry. And she writes, this is the quote, "By feeding normal kids with normal problems into an unending pipeline, the mental health industry is minting patients faster than it can cure them. The mental health experts have trained kids to regard themselves as disordered. They talk of wellness while presiding over the downward spiral of the most unwell generation in history." So, Bishop, do you think there's any merit to her critique of the industry, the mental health care industry, she calls it?
Yeah, I do think there's merit to it. It's a strong critique, and I don't know her thought well enough to say I utterly subscribe to it, but the instincts there, I think, are really right. The danger is if we are trying to protect our kids at all costs from suffering and from risk and from trial, they will not grow up. That's true. In a way, education in all of its dimensions is a kind of steady exposure to risk, right? Not crazy, but a steady exposure to risk so that you can take the next step. Think of that stuff from the ancient myths about leaving the familiar and moving into the unfamiliar. That's always risky, and that's true intellectually, psychologically, and physically. If I'm going to grow up, I got to move out of the safety of the space I'm in psychologically and risk new ideas, new experiences. I think in the course of my lifetime, the riskiest moments have been the most kind of interesting and intriguing, whether as a little kid going to my first baseball practice or my first day of school, you're leaving something you're familiar with. It's very anxiety producing, but because of that, a whole world opened up. and my parents knew enough to say, well, yeah, you got to go through that door and it's going to be a little painful. Well, now extrapolate from that to wider and deeper issues that we're facing that all the time. I would say too, as a Christian, what's the ultimate risk is death itself. There's a door we all have to go through. That's not to be avoided at all costs, but rather seen as an invitation to a higher and deeper life. So I do agree with the instinct that says, preventing kids from experiencing risk and pain and suffering, that's a really dangerous perspective. It's that corny, I remember as a young guy seeing this poster, but it's the instinct is right, that a ship is safe in a harbor, but it's not meant for a harbor. Right. The ship is meant to sail out onto the dangerous seas. So yeah, that ship will never be damaged as I keep it in the harbor. Actually, it will. I mean, that's the thing. Actually, it will be. It's true of automobiles, isn't it? As little as I know about automobiles, but a car that's not driven is a car that will go bad very quickly. And actually it's the driving of the car, The same with our bodies, the same with our psyches. Psyches and bodies that are kept safe actually will deteriorate. And it's the constant risk of something new and fresh and a little bit dangerous that will call us into deeper life. So a risky approach to life, not crazy risky, but a willingness to embrace the new, the different, the dangerous, the fresh, the unusual. That's a key to flourishing, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's very strong empirical research now that shows everything that you're saying. In fact, that our brain isn't even capable of learning in a long-term sense without some kind of risk and danger involved.
Right. And so if we're, again, we're putting a, bubble wrap around everybody all the time. It's funny, man, I think it's changed in the course of my lifetime. When I was a little kid, my dear mother, she put a T-shirt and shorts on us and gym shoes, and off we went. I mean, we didn't want. And I vaguely remember maybe coming home for lunch and then dinner. But believe me, my parents, that generation, they were not helicopter parents at all. Right. They kind of let us. And of course, you fall off your bike, and of course, you get in fights, and of course, you face these things you hadn't thought about before, and that's how you grow up, So I do worry about that if we're coddling kids too much.
It's so different now.
Yeah.
So Schreier also strongly critiques what she says, using emotion as a guide to both to how to raise your children and then teaching your children how they should act. Yeah. So here's another key quote. Yeah. She says, very often kids should be skeptical that their feelings reflect an accurate picture of the world and even ignore their feelings entirely. Mm-hmm. And she says a healthy emotional life involves a certain amount of daily repression. Now, the secular mind hears the word repress your emotions, and that itself sounds dangerous. But is she onto something here?
Yeah, it's a complicated thing you're raising there. But think of like classical virtue, like courage. Courage is the virtue that holds off fear so that you can accomplish justice. So if you say justice is, roughly speaking, doing the right thing, what's called for, the right thing. Well, sometimes that means you're going to put yourself in some danger and you're going to feel the very strong emotion of fear, right? Courage is a virtue that says, I'm not denying that fear, but I am setting it aside. I'm moving past it to achieve this high good. If I'm reading my life entirely in terms of my emotions, I won't be able to accomplish those goods. There's a kind of purification or refinement that happens as we distantiate ourselves from our immediate emotions. Then we're living at the level of a child, right? That you're just governed by your immediate emotional reaction. There has to be a certain distanciation from that. So yeah, I would worry about that. But you're touching on a deeper point, which to me is very interesting, is the valorization of emotion and feeling. Mm-hmm. And this implication, any sort of setting aside, whether it's, is repression or suppression or whatever, any setting aside of emotion is dangerous, so you don't do it. Well, no, the great tradition has said just the contrary. It doesn't despise the emotions. Look at Aquinas on the passions. I mean, Aquinas talked a lot about the passions. It doesn't despise them. So you might say there's a legitimate Freudian, insight is, well, no, you don't suppress and despise your passions, but you order them according to reason. And that's as old as Plato, right? That's the charioteer of reason that's governing these wild kind of horses of the different passions. But if the charioteer is kicked out, the passions run amok. If the charioteer is in place, right, reason, well, then there's a lot of energy. And see, there, let your passions indeed contribute to your accomplishment of the good. Here I think of like Dietrich von Hildebrand, who I think quite legitimately said, maybe our tradition got too rationalistic and we kind of despised what he called the heart, right, the seat of emotions. But I think he would have certainly said, under the guidance and governance of reason. But then your passions can give you all kinds of energy. But if we're governed by them, the horse has gotten into the chariot.
Right. And from a Catholic perspective, can we say that the emotions they're not necessarily fixed, that there's the possibility, they're corrigible, there's the possibility of not only guiding them, but maybe even creating new emotions to put them more in line with what's good?
Yeah, and that's, I think, the Platonic image as well. And they should serve the good. See, that's always the principle. They're not the criterion. They should serve the good. If they contribute to my understanding of the good, now there I go back to someone like Martha Nussbaum at your old school. And I think she's right about this. She's like William James, that there is a cognitive value to emotion. Right. Sometimes our emotions can tell us truths that our minds don't quite get. I think that's right. So I'm not despising emotions, but all of it should be in service of the good and my pursuit and attainment of the good. If the emotions start running the chariot and deviating me from the good, now I got a problem.
So people who are skeptical of the Catholic view of reality may be listening to the conversation up to this point and say, okay, I can see that maybe we've taken it too far, safety with regards to psychological and emotional well-being, but physical safety, that's categorically different, and it still makes sense to pedestal physical safety as our higher good. What's the response to that?
Again, it's a good, but it can't be the highest good. So, Aquinas and the great natural law tradition would talk about, self-preservation. Life is a good. Physical life is a good. Protecting it, obviously, is a good. And so, sure, in that sense, it's something to be pursued. But it's arranged hierarchically. Because if my physical safety were the supreme value, I'd never talk about martyrs. And we honor and reverence our martyrs. We never talk about saints who put their lives at risk to achieve certain goods. I'd never valorize even a soldier, the courage of a soldier on a battlefield. Why would he be honored? I'd say that guy's an idiot. Why is he exposing himself to that much danger? So it can't be the summum bonum. See, I think, Matt, that's a very important thing for everyone to think about. First of all, to name what is the summum bonum in your life. Because I think the Bible again and again and again is testing us. It's asking that question. Hey, Lord, I'll follow you, but first, let me bury my father. I mean, look, I'm a family man, and here's this very family-oriented society, ancient Israel. Jesus, let the dead bury their dead. Now, is he being cruel and unkind? No, it's a typical biblical move to say, yes, the family is great, but it's not the summum bonum. I'm the summum bonum, Jesus is saying. Abraham and Isaac, Abraham, Isaac, your son, whom you love, your beloved, Isaac. Well, I'd like you to sacrifice him to me. Well, we're always being emotionally manipulative. No, it's a typical biblical, it's a test. What's your summum bonum? So that's a really good exercise. Or, I use the example of my hero, Thomas Aquinas, when the Lord says, what do you want? I'll give you any reward you want. What do you want? That's a test. It's a summum bonum test, right? So if Thomas said, I want to be the most famous theologian in the world. I want to be the richest man in the world. Get me out of this lousy Dominican friary and into a castle. Well, then you'd know, okay, that's his summum bonum. But when Thomas said, non nisi te domine, I'll have nothing except you. Okay, now I got it. And see, then you're clear. Then you're right. If God's the summum bonum, then the various worldly goods will arrange themselves in proper relation to the summum bonum, and the worldly goods themselves will fall into a right hierarchical arrangement. But see, I think that has been lost. That's one of our big problems today, is people don't have a sense of a moral structure. And so, of course, I'll cling to my safety or what I want. My will becomes the summum bonum. Man, does the Bible know about that, by the way, all the time. Mm-hmm. That's called grasping of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is that I become the criterion of good and evil. I'm the summum bonum around here, And then Nietzsche, well, you got your summum bonum, I got my summum bonum. In fact, it's my heroic will against your heroic will. What are you left with but this warfare beyond good and evil? When Hobbes, as you know, explicitly says, there is no such thing as this highest good that the ancient philosophers talk about. What are you left with? The war of all against all. Right. That can only be tempered by, a totalitarian state. So this is not an abstract problem. This is not some little idle thing for philosophers to speculate about. This is a really serious matter of knowing what the summum bonum is and how to arrange the goods around it.
And is it accurate to say both that there must be a summum bonum in every human being's life, and there can only be one?
Yes, and I find a very intriguing part of Aquinas' Summa that he has the famous 5 arguments for God, but there's an implicit argument in the beginning of the Prima Secundae when he asks just that question. And he's dead right about this, is any act of the will, so even our sitting here right now talking, if you do a little analysis of like, okay, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing it because it's part of my Word on Fire ministry. Well, why is that important? Well, because Word on Fire is meant to announce the gospel. Well, why is that important? With any act, you just keep going out until you find, oh yeah, well, I'm doing it because it's good. That's the good. And if you can't end it that way, you got the infinite regress problem. And then there is no explanation. We're just here bazooing for no apparent reason. See? So it has to be grounded finally in a prime mover of the will, of a final cause that's luring the will. And everyone's got that. So Aquinas would say, everyone is, in fact, being motivated by God, but they might have mistaken ideas about, who God is. They think it's wealth or power or something. Mm-hmm. But that's a very important spiritual move. Everyone's got, Paul Tillich called it the ultimate concern. Mm-hmm. Or what concerns you ultimately, that's God for you. The point is trying to get the true God in that place of ultimate concern.
We'll move with our remaining minutes here more deeply into the Catholic tradition, the theological tradition. But before we do, how do we assess this claim, coming primarily from the secular world, that speech itself can make us unsafe because speech is a form of violence? Well,
no one doubts that speech can be violent. I mean, if I'm attacking someone, I'm going after can speech be wounding to people? Sure. I mean, I've been wounded by people's speech. So that's, I think, true. It's a kind of a commonplace to say that. The danger is when you press that thing the way it's being pressed today, something like rational conversation is obviated. Mm-hmm. Right? So if I'm saying something that you find disagreeable, and therefore I can't say it's offensive to me or it's off-putting to me, well then rational conversation breaks down. When rational conversation breaks down, what are we left with? The Nietzschean or Hobbesian world of the all against all. We have just competing wills. And so it's very dangerous. If you're concerned about violence, you should be very concerned about the integrity of speech. When you start saying, speech itself is violent, that's the invitation to real violence, it seems to me. So the breakdown of conversation, and again, I've used Aquinas. Thomas, who in the literary text that we have, dialogues with a whole range of people, right? Ancient philosophers and scientists, his medieval contemporaries, Islamic scholars, Jewish scholars. Great. He's having a conversation with them, disciplined, not like, hey, don't we all agree deep down? No, he's sharp disagreement, but he's willing to talk. And that's very important for our civilization.
Is it justified to make a distinction, recognizing that speech certainly can be violent and its intention can be violent? Is it still justified to make a distinction between speech and physical violence in this sense, that when we hear speech, it's always going to go through some psychological filter, and that filter may determine how we perceive the violence of the speech, whereas with bodily violence, there's no psychological filter, and sort of it's clear whether it's violent or not, objectively so.
Right, and I do think it is dangerous to go down this path that many are going down today, to see speech as because it just precludes what we need to have a real civilized society. That concerns me a lot.
Let's turn directly to some very biblical themes here. Yeah. So two of the spiritual works of mercy, which all Catholics are called to practice, maybe could potentially be interpreted as trying to care for the psychological or emotional well-being of ourselves and our neighbors, and that's counseling the doubtful and comforting the afflicted.
Yeah, sure.
How do we shield that from a kind of Schreier critique that says, no, that's coddling, that's bad, we don't want to do that?
Well, yeah, I suppose at the extreme it becomes that, but no, in itself, look, we're on to care for each other, and that's what those works of mercy are about. And if you can relieve someone's suffering, yeah, do it by all means. But when we press these things the way they're being pressed, they become irrational and counterproductive, morally speaking. But no, I have no quarrel with that. Of course, if someone's suffering, they're in pain, do what you can to alleviate it. But don't eliminate the pain that will allow them actually to grow. That's not what's being addressed by those, works of mercy. It's like when you talk to someone who's going through a real doubt psychologically or theologically, great. That's a kind of pain that might lead them, and counseling the doubtful might be, using that as an opportunity to help them grow. So I just make that distinction, I suppose.
And as you also know, the cardinal virtues are justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude. And for this context, we might also add the theological virtue of love. Where would you locate safety within those frameworks, if at all?
Yeah, see, I would put it further down, and I prefer to start there. The way I look at those is justice, you might say, is the central one, because justice is doing the right thing, right? Rendering to each his due. So what's called for morally in the moment. Now, to hold off external threats to that, I need courage, because there might be external threats to say, no, don't do the just thing. To hold off internal threats to it, I need temperance. So I might have something in my interior life that's keeping me from doing the right thing, my own lusts or my own disordered passions. So I need temperance to hold those off. Then I finally need prudence to tell me, okay, concretely, how do I do the right thing in this situation? Well, now, where does safety fit in there? I don't know if it's in that mix that much. Because if I'm prioritizing safety, I think that whole process gets interrupted, right? I won't do the right thing because it's too threatening to me. Courage, well, heck, I protect me, right away. I'm not going to call forth courage. So put it in the hierarchy of values, but much lower than those, for example.
And finally, Bishop, what does Christ crucified, Christ on the cross, teach us about safety?
I used that line. I was in Lisbon last summer for World Youth Day, and I gave a talk to the kids. There were like 15,000 kids in this big field. And it kind of came to me as inspiration at the end of the talk, where I just said, I know you guys hear a lot about safety, to safe space and be safe. And there was a crucifix up there in the sanctuary, and I said, take a look at this. This religion is not one that's putting a huge premium on safety. Right. When we're putting before your eyes a man nailed to a cross dying to do the right thing, if I can put it in that kind of simple virtue language, that's not a religion that's saying the summum bonum is safety. What it's saying is the summum bonum is a love that risks itself even to the point of death. Okay, that's the summum bonum. Now, does that mean every single moment of your life you must be doing that? No, that's the summum bonum. That's who God is. And if I want to live my life according to the highest good, I got to be ordered to that. So safety, okay, but it's not the highest good that runs the whole operation.
Well, Bishop, it's now time for our listener question. Today we have Daniel from Florida asking about the conditions for absolution in the sacrament of confession.
Okay.
Hi, Bishop. My name is Daniel from Florida. And my question is, can a priest ever deny someone absolution during confession? Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, okay. The short answer is yes. The priest is in the confessional, as a bearer of Christ's mercy and all that. He's also there as judge. So you're judging a couple of things. What are the sins being confessed here? Are they mortal sins or are they venial sins? Secondly, is the person demonstrating sufficient contrition for those sins? And then thirdly, a firm purpose of amendment. So, when you pray the act of contrition, that's not just decorative. That's essential to the sacramental moment, because the priest has to determine, okay, this person really knows, it has been crushed by this. That's what contritio means in Latin. You've been crushed by the weight of this sin. You know it's serious. And then you're saying, I resolve to avoid this sin in the future. If those two things aren't there, the priest can judge, well, you're not ready to receive absolution. So it can happen. I would suggest it's very rare, and that the assumption is always in favor of expressing Christ's mercy. But yeah, you can, in certain circumstances, refuse absolution.
Well, thanks so much, Daniel, for reaching out to us. If you'd like to ask Bishop Barron a question for a future Word on Fire show, please visit askbishopbarron.com. askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com and submit your question there. Bishop, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us again in studio, and I look forward to next time.
Always joy to be with you. Thanks, man.
That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. We'll see you next time.